All right, good morning, everyone. I am going to get started soon. I just wanted to welcome everybody to our due diligence training this morning. And it looks like we have a pretty big group. We might have another minute or two to make sure everybody gets here. Since we do have a lot to cover, I am going to get started. I am Teresa Vaplon with the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. We'll be starting the presentation today on Housing Stability Services 2022 Due Diligence Training. And while I'm presenting, I am going to turn off my camera here and do some talking. Okay, so again, thank you for coming. Next slide. I want to take a moment and talk about the mission of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and to stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. It also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. It has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of our state's most vulnerable citizens. Next slide. There we go. So this is our agenda for today. And again, thank you all for coming and congratulations. As I mentioned, I'm Teresa Vaplon with Minnesota Housing. I'm a community partnership officer and will be presenting the Housing Stability Services Program overview today. I'm then going to turn it over to Meredith Mayrand, who will cover due diligence items, submissions, and deadlines. We will have time at the end for questions, and the chat is being monitored for questions as we move along. Next slide. Housekeeping item I want to make sure that everyone is aware of is that there are 2 meetings all agencies are required to attend as part of the process. One meeting is this full group meeting that we're in right now, and the second meeting is a one-on-one meeting set up between Minnesota Housing staff and each individual agency. The one-on-one meetings are new and will hopefully offer us the opportunity to better connect with agencies and more easily match up names, faces, and roles as we move ahead in this process. The individual meetings have started, and all agencies should have a date and time for that meeting, both on your award letter as well as a Teams meeting invite. So please reach out if you do not have the meeting invite for this. Next. Now is the time that we're going to dive into some of the details of Housing Stability Services Program. Next. There are core principles and values that we have used to guide this process that are important to note as we move along towards seeing the Housing Stability Services come to fruition. Providers are encouraged to use a human-centered approach and utilize intentional strategies to reach out to those who are least likely to know about housing opportunities. It's also important for providers to be intentional to avoid perpetuating the conditions that create and maintain racial disparities. Next is a focus on customer service experience that minimizes stress and uncertainty for the client, and operating in a transparent environment with both timeliness and flexibility throughout the process. Organizations by and for communities most impacted are critical partners for equitable outcomes. Next. Eligibility for the program. Households that are eligible to receive services under this Housing Stability Services Program are renter households in Minnesota with income no more than 80% of AMI. The household is at risk of housing instability or homelessness, such as possible eviction, lease termination, or other financial impact. A household member qualified for unemployment, had a decrease in income or increase in expenses, or other financial hardship during or due directly or indirectly to the pandemic. Minnesota Housing will be providing the verification forms for agencies to utilize to ensure households meet these eligibility requirements, and written attestation of these requirements is sufficient. Reminder that no additional eligibility criteria can be added, such as further income restrictions, only taking referrals from coordinated entry, or only serving agencies' existing households. Any household who meets these eligibility requirements is eligible for services. All right, I think we're on the right slide. The Housing Stability Services funds are federal dollars and have different requirements than what agencies may be used to. And there are some specific requirements I want to draw your attention to that all agencies should be aware of. As previously mentioned, agencies agree to provide services to any household that meets the reviewed eligibility requirements in your geographic service area until your program capacity is reached. A very important point I want to stress again is that agencies are agreeing to accept referrals from all community resources, and enrollment cannot be limited to existing households. Agencies agree not to add any additional requirements, including further limiting the income requirements. All supportive services must be tied to an eligible household. The household will always be the first step, and then the services provided are tied to that household. And lastly, funds are for supportive services only and cannot be used for any direct payment assistance, such as rent, utilities, application fees, or gift cards. Next. The scope of work involves the main services of eviction prevention and housing navigation. Eviction prevention services may include outreach and engagement to connect households not currently accessing services, assessment that includes working collaboratively with households to identify strengths, resources, barriers, and needs in context of their local environment, connection, such as obtaining for the household necessary mainstream services, benefits, treatment, legal services, and supports, coordination by bringing together all the service providers in order to integrate services and help ensure consistency of service plans, housing counseling, such as providing services to the person, including budget counseling and tenant education, conflict mediation, including providing proactive engagement and mediation services with landlords, personal and legal advocacy, such as interceding on behalf of the household to help ensure access to timely and appropriate services, and follow-up to maintain contact with the household after completion of services to track stability and provide additional services if needed. Housing navigation services could include utilizing housing search engines to locate opportunities for households, consistent communication with the household's landlord to maintain a positive relationship and mitigate any issues that may arise, assisting survivors of domestic abuse or human trafficking with housing-related services, assisting households in completing housing applications or obtaining application fees, transporting households to housing appointments, assisting households in communicating to a potential landlord any housing barriers, providing tenant education on landlord and tenant rights and responsibilities, and expediting the move-in timeline when feasible between the acceptance and lease signing. Following up with households to track stability and provide additional services after exiting the program as needed. All services should be delivered in a culturally specific manner, including language and materials interpretation. And agencies will also need to create awareness for the programming with marketing and outreach. Next. For invoicing and reports. Invoices will be due the 10th of the month and will include expenditures and the number of clients served. The invoices will need to include supporting documentation for all expenses, such as payroll and receipts. Again, because this is a federal grant, there's more thorough documentation of expenses required. I also want to note that the 10th is a very firm deadline for invoices. Minnesota Housing has reporting due on the 15th of the month. That's dependent on these invoices being received. So there's little room for flexibility with this deadline. Every quarter, there will be more detailed reports submitted that would include client demographics, outcomes, and a more narrative style of reporting. If the grant contract agreement is executed on time, the contract will begin on June 15th. And so that means the first invoice would be due July 10th for the June 15th to June 30th time period. After that, the invoicing period would be a full month time. Next. Allowable expenses under this contract are the eviction prevention and housing navigation services that I detailed earlier that are tied to an eligible household. Other program expenses allowed include travel mileage, office, computer, phone, directly related to the staff providing the housing navigation and eviction prevention services, training, marketing and outreach, technology, and personal protective equipment. Next. Administration costs are limited to 15% of the total grant and may include the following: audit, accounting, human resources, office, computer, phone for administrative staff, and other direct expenses associated with administering the program. Next. Now I'm going to turn it over to Meredith Mayran, and she will cover in more detail the due diligence items.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith Mayran, and I will be working with you very closely over the next few weeks with the submission of your due diligence items. So we'll be going through the following list of items in a little bit more detail. You can also refer to your selection letter and accompanying due diligence checklist for more information on these particular items. So we'll be going through the work plan and budget, the unique entity identifier, SWIFT vendor number for payments, your W-9, EFT forms if applicable. You can go to the next slide, Diane. Documentation of delegated signing authority, the name and contact information of your authorized signers, and the grant contract agreement. I did want to make one quick note about the grant contract agreement. The contract that was sent to you with your selection letters was for your reference and informational purposes. So for that document, signing will be initiated by Minnesota Housing via DocuSign once all of the other due diligence items have been submitted and approved. We'll go over a little bit more detail about the contract shortly. Next slide, please. So the work plan, you'll want to submit your work plan, including changes from the submitted application as a result of the final award amount and the conditions outlined in your selection letter. This is an item that can often take some back and forth between program staff and you as administrators, so we encourage you to submit this as early as possible in the process. If you're still gathering your other due diligence items, feel free to still send the work plan along in advance so that we can begin that review process and have any dialogue necessary if that will be needed. Next slide. Similarly to the work plan, the budget document can be submitted as soon as it's ready. You'll want to adjust the budget allocations, including the budgets for your subgrantees in proportion to your award amount. Make sure you pay attention to the total of the budget to make sure it matches your contract amount, as well as the required administration percentage that Teresa referenced earlier. Program staff will be reviewing the budgets that you submit and will be in contact if there are any revisions required. Next slide, please. The Unique Entity ID, or UEI, is a federal requirement that we'll need in order to execute your grant contract. You probably would have noticed on the grant contract that was sent to you with your selection letter that there is a UEI section in red that will be populating once you submit the UEI during this due diligence phase. Unique Entity ID is a 12-character alphanumeric identifier for businesses provided by SAM.gov. This transitioned in early April from the Data Universal Numbering, or DUNS number system. If you have an entity registration in SAM.gov, even if your registration has expired, you already have a Unique Entity ID, and you'll be able to find that by signing into SAM.gov and selecting the Entities widget in your workspace, or by just searching the entity information to locate your organization. If you've used the DUNS number with your previous federal contracts or grants, you can check the interactive guide linked below to determine what action you need to take to get your UEI. And we'll be making this information available to you so that you have the necessary links to get this information. Another resource, if you want to look into the UEI transition, would be to go to fsd.gov to learn more. Next slide, please. The SWIFT vendor number is required for us to be able to make payments to your organization. It's the state payment system, so if you've not yet registered as a vendor with the state of Minnesota, you'll need to complete that prior to receiving your first payment. You'll want to visit the vendor registration link to complete this process if you've not already done so. If you have a SWIFT vendor number, but you're struggling to locate it, feel free to get in touch with me and I can work with our finance department to assist with that. Next slide, please. In addition to the SWIFT vendor number, we ask that you submit a current W-9, a completed and signed copy for payment purposes. Again, there's a link here if you need that. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly about the W-9. Next slide. We'll also need an electronic funds transfer form if you're a new grantee. The EFT form allows direct deposits of funds directly to your agency's financial institution. So we have a link for that form if you've not already sent that in to us or worked with us in the past. If you've not already registered as a vendor with the state of Minnesota, you'll need to do that prior to completing the EFT form. Again, that same link that we referenced earlier. And the W-9 would also need to be submitted along with an EFT form if you're new to working with Minnesota Housing. There's also an electronic funds change form, and that's referenced on the following slide. If you've worked with us but you've had a change to your banking information, you'll want to fill out the EFT bank change request form and submit that along with your due diligence items. If you have worked with us in the past but have no change to your banking information, when you send in your items, you can just confirm that there's been no change and no need to submit either of those documents. Next slide. Delegated signing authority is documentation of who specifically is authorized to execute this grant contract agreement. It could be a board resolution, bylaws, or another organizational document. And we'll be using that in order to route the contract for signing. So we'll need to make sure that the person outlined in that documentation, we also have contact information for. Next slide. So along with the documentation of delegated signing authority, please also submit the names, email addresses, and routing order, if applicable, of your authorized signers. This information will be used to route the document for electronic signature via DocuSign, and it can just be included in the body of the email if it's not specified in the documentation outlining who has delegated signing authority for your organization. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the grant contract agreement will be signed via the DocuSign process. You will not need to submit this item using the mhfa.grants email. You don't need to have it signed with a wet signature and electronic signature on your end, because we'll be initiating the signing of that once all of your other items have been submitted and approved. We encourage you to review the entire grant contract agreement and all of the exhibits to ensure accuracy and understand compliance. It's very important that you review the exhibits, including the reporting timeline that was included, as well as the additional federal requirements. Since these are federal funds, there are some additional requirements you'll want to familiarize yourself with prior to signing the contract. As I mentioned earlier, you have received a copy of the grant contract to review. The one section with the UEI at the very top of the contract will be adjusted once that number is submitted. I'd also encourage you to look closely at who's listed as your authorized representative and confirm that that information is also correct. I'm going to highlight a few important dates on your grant contract agreement: the effective date, the grant period, and the expiration date. The effective date will either be June 15th or the date when the grant contract agreement is fully executed, whichever is later. It's the date when all parties have executed the grant contract, including the signer for both your organization and for Minnesota Housing. And it's the date when you can start incurring costs under the terms of the grant contract agreement. Any expenses incurred prior to the execution of the grant by both parties are not allowed. The grant period of the contract is from the date that the contract has been executed through June 30th, 2023. This is the time period in which grant proceeds must be incurred and expended. No funds can be used prior to or after this time. And then the expiration date is August 31st, 2023, and that's the date by which all final reports, documents, and other requirements must be submitted by the grantee to Minnesota Housing. Any final payments are made by Minnesota Housing to your organization, and any unexpended funds would be returned to Minnesota Housing. So the expiration date just allows those last 2 months for final payments and reports. All right, so a little bit about submission and deadlines. You can submit all items except for the signed grant contract agreement to mhfa.grants@state.mn.us, and please include in the subject line the project name and grantee name. For example, ERA HSS-Wonderful Agency. No need to wait for all items to be complete before submitting documents. Please submit the work plan and budget as soon as possible. And even if you have other items that are ready, feel free to send them all at once, one at a time, whatever works best for your organization. Please name all the documents by grantee name and due diligence name. For example, Wonderful Agency Work Plan, Wonderful Agency W-9. The one exception would be the grant contract agreement. As I mentioned, that will be signed via DocuSign, so we ask that you review it and let us know if you have any questions, but no need to sign that. Again, feel free to start submitting items as soon as possible to allow enough time for everything to be reviewed, revised if needed, and approved. All items must be received and approved prior to the execution of the grant contract. Reimbursement of expenses incurred prior to Minnesota Housing's execution of the grant contract agreement will not be allowed. All items must be submitted and received by 4:30 p.m. on Friday, May 20th, 2022, and questions related to any of the due diligence items can be directed to mhsa.grants@state.mn.us. Please do feel free to be in touch with any questions that come up for you throughout the process and send them to that email. I think that covers the main due diligence items. So we'll open it up to questions. Please feel free to either raise a hand so that you can be unmuted, or type your questions in and we can respond to those.
All right, so if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand at this time, and I can make sure that you're unmuted.
We do have one question in the chat. This is the question. For projects with subgrantees, do we need to submit entity documents such as the unique ID just for the primary grantee or also for subgrantees? And then the secondary question is there a required subgrantee contract format?
You'll only need to submit the UEI for the grantee organization at this time. If we need that additional information for your subgrantees, we'll be sure to reach out and let you know. And in terms of the subgrantee contracts, I can maybe be in touch with you a little bit more further about that after we connect with our grants manager about that. So I can check with Nancy on the questioner and get that information sent to you specifically.
I think Matt has a question. He raised a hand, so. Matt? I think, Matt, you are self-muted, so maybe if you see the icon, which looks like a microphone, you might need to unmute and share your comment or question.
I'm going to try to unmute Matt because it does look like he's muted by us as well, but.
Oh, I just tried and Simsy said that self-muted.
And now it's self-muted, so he can try now.
Perhaps while we're trying to unmute Matt, I do have another question in the chat. Has the list of the selected Housing Stability Services recipients been posted? We are thinking about how we should plan for outreach, hiring, et cetera, if there are recipients who may be serving the same geographic area.
Well, I don't believe that we have anything posted at this time. My understanding is once the contracts are finalized, it would be posted. So if someone wants to jump in from Minnesota Housing, if they have a different understanding, but at this time there is not anything posted.
So that's my understanding as well. We don't have that at this time. I think once grant awards are announced, there might be some information linked. And I believe that information will be shared with 211 about who the grant administrators are. So then at that point, but there's not going to be the same setup, at least at this point, as we had with some of the rent assistance programs that were federally funded, where you could actually click on a map and geography. We don't have that in place yet.
I'll just keep going with questions in the chat, and if Dee, perhaps if you could monitor hands that are raised, and we can work on this together. Next question, what is the priority, serving the number of households or the racial breakdown?
So I'm assuming this is in relation to the table. And so I believe the table, at least that's being filled out for the outcomes, is the percent that are expected to be stably housed by race and ethnicity. if that makes sense. So your total in the table would be like 100% of households at the end. But the percentages are really about who's stably housed at exit. It's not like your total's not going to turn out to be 100, if that makes sense.
Matt, if I see that your hand is still raised, if you're unable to be unmuted, we welcome you to enter your chat into the question and we'll do our very best to answer it. This next question is for you, Teresa. Can you discuss in more detail about the reporting that is required during the contract?
So what we're looking for on a monthly basis is expenditures. So monthly invoices will be coming in with expenditures. And at that monthly report, the only overall, I'd say, number that you're giving us related to the services you're providing is just the number of households served. So the monthly reports are really focused on the financials with just an overall number of households served. The quarterly reports are going to be more of a narrative style that would include, and we'll provide templates for both of these. I think that there was a question about that as well. So both of these will have a format that you'll be able to utilize. So the quarterly reports would have demographics, optional demographics, outcomes, narrative style of successes, what's the agency working on, what are any challenges they're running up against, and that would be submitted every quarter. So those are the two main things that would be submitted throughout the grant contract.
We have another raised hand from Macron. I think I unmuted you. Yeah, you should be able to speak to us.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Wonderful. I also put this into the chat, but I can just speak about it. I was just wondering, once we reach the capacity of the household, the client households per our contract, if one or more disengages or doesn't want services, do we add more households to that, or the fact that we engage them meets the threshold? I'm just wondering to see what happens if clients or households disengage at some point throughout the process.
Teresa, I can take this one. That's a great question. I think you will probably face that circumstance. I think everyone will. And you'll meet the threshold by providing the service initially, but I think the capacity for your organization to serve additional households might be there as a result, and so you're certainly able to exceed the household number, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And is there a limited amount of time, just as a piggyback on that question, that we need to engage, or just to make sure that we're meeting the contractual obligation?
So we don't have a specific set amount of time. I can really understand that there will be circumstances when you're engaging with a household and then there's not a further connection for some reason. What I would say is if you're able to collect that information about the household eligibility and be able to secure their signature and so on and start to interact with that client, I would think you could count them at that point. If you're just having a phone call and you don't even have that information or their signature about whether they're eligible, sort of that attestation form that Teresa talked about, then I probably would not count that client as being served.
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat, and this may be one that you may or may not be able to answer, Meredith. Will this contract trigger a single audit for 2022 and 2023, or just a regular audit? And I think in this case, I think you may be talking about a single federal audit, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer.
Yeah, great questions. I would like to just check with our grants manager on that. So again, Jennifer, we can reach out with more specific information for you on that. Thanks, Nancy.
Lauren, I see you have a question. You are self-muted, so if you click the little microphone, there you go. Feel free to ask your question.
Hi, yes, it's Lorraine. Thank you.
I apologize.
Lauren, I think your mic got muted again, so.
Not sure how that happened. Can you hear me now?
We can, Lorraine.
Okay, sorry about that. I was saying I wanted to kind of chime in on the last question that the gentleman was asking in regards to the numbers served. And so the way we had written in our proposal with the population of people that we serve, it's possible that we serve more of a homelessness population versus those that may be housed or at risk of losing their housing or possible, the possible eviction process. I'm trying to see, is there some space in there with how we projected our numbers if they're not met totally, or if they look different than what we proposed. If there's room there. Does that make sense?
Sure. So just so I can clarify, I'm assuming that you're talking about if, let's say, you're proposing 10 households to be served that aren't yet homeless, and maybe 10 households that might be homeless, but you find as you're going through the process that you're serving more households who are homeless rather than prevention, what kind of flexibility there is there?
Correct.
So Teresa, your thoughts on this?
I'm thinking because we're looking at overall number served, sometimes the population that you end up serving or the services provided within that may have to flex depending on who comes to you. You can anticipate what needs people might have and how that might look, but there is flexibility, and we're also not asking specifically, because some agencies are focusing on the housing navigation and some on eviction prevention and some on both. So if an agency is doing both, there's not separate reporting for those. So there is flexibility within that as well. So, I mean, the agencies know best what the client needs to get to the desired outcome, I guess, is what I'm going towards. Did you add any other thoughts on that, Diane?
Yeah, I think that's where my mind is thinking as well, right? And I appreciate all these questions because this is a new program for us. And so it's really helpful to hear from you on some of the anticipated issues that might come up. And I'm in agreement with, we're really looking at being able to serve those households overall, however they're coming to you. And the quarterly reports will hopefully provide some opportunity to give us some narrative about that. That's an opportunity to say, we thought they were all going to be prevention with the exception of a couple, but instead we're finding we're serving more homeless households, and that's what, here's what this looks like, and just your opportunity to give us feedback about what's happening with your program.
Right. I would also add too, just as a general note for everybody, is as this grant starts up, we will be having provider meetings on a regular basis, and I will be facilitating those. But we really see the agencies that we're partnering with as the experts in providing those services. So we hope to have those meetings set up as a roundtable where instead of waiting for a full quarter to pass, we can discuss in more detail what's working, what's not, what agencies are seeing that they weren't expecting, and hopefully that will give everybody time to maybe do some pivoting and reworking. And then we are also, Minnesota Housing is also in the loop of what the agencies are seeing, because like Diane mentioned, this is new to us as well. So we really appreciate everybody being here and working through it together.
Thank you. I just have one more question. Those were really good answers. Because as an agency that has focused over a period of time, especially through COVID, on the navigation process, the population, it's more folks that are homeless than not, at least that's where we're serving. So my last question is about what's the priority, serving the number of households or the racial breakdown, or of the racial breakdown? So is that some fluidity there too as well? Because I think if we said we were going to serve X amount of African Americans, but we have X amount more American Indians, or if is there room for it to fluctuate?
Yeah, there is actually. So for example, if in that table you filled out that you were going to serve 5 African American households and 5 Native American households, and then you end up serving all African American households, that's not an issue. We're not looking for, we're certainly interested in being able to see that there are providers that can reach populations, especially those that are disparately impacted. So we obviously hope that you're able to reach some of the populations you described in your application, but we also understand that there are limits to how many households can be served, and you might be serving households that have received your marketing and are coming to you. And so, I think it's, again, one of those things where you have some flexibility in describing that in your quarterly narrative. And then the percent, we're really more interested in the percent stably housed at exit of who you're serving. So if you are serving households, particularly populations of color, we really want to know what the outcome is at the end. Are they stably housed at the same rate as non-white households? And that's kind of where that question is going.
We have another question. If we're not funded to the amount we requested, how are we to decide when to deny services to clients? I can take a stab at this, unless Teresa or Diane, you want to answer?
Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, so what I'll say to that, Eric, is when you submit your work plan and revised budget, we'll be looking for you, if you did not receive what you requested, we'll be looking for you to modify your budget accordingly, as well as your proposed number of households served. So theoretically speaking, if you received 50% of your request, we would expect, be looking for around 50-ish% of the proposed households to be served. And then you'll need to adjust your staffing accordingly. And so when determining your capacity, there's 2 factors to consider. Number one is, as you know, we asked that question for you. We asked you to demonstrate how you'll be able to manage funds to last throughout the duration of the grant term. That's the first one. And then the second is you'll want to look at your staffing capacity. And so if a staff has an average caseload of 20 households and you have 2 staff and they're at capacity in that moment, we would understand if you take a break for a moment for taking new households until there's room on that staff caseload to begin accepting new households. Another question. How does this program differ from other current programs, especially NeighborWorks Housing Stability Counseling Program that caters to at-risk renters and homeowners, both of which have no direct assistance?
I would say that, first of all, I'm not entirely familiar with the programs referenced. But what this program is coming from is the emergency rental assistance on the federal level. So this is a carve-out niche out of the rent assistance dollars that came, that supplied the Rent Help Minnesota with all of the funds to pay the direct rent assistance. And so as that program, it stopped taking new applications in January, and applications are being worked through and phased down. This is kind of the second part to that, realizing that the direct dollars may have saved some renters from being evicted, but that doesn't mean that there's still not a housing crisis present. And so this speaks more to the services that some of those families may still require, even as they may have gotten some direct assistance dollars. If anybody else has more familiarity with the other programs, you may be able to speak to the actual difference, but that's what I would say this program has come from, or where it's kind of grown out of, and the niche it had aimed to fill.
I think that's a great description, Teresa. You know, again, these are pandemic focused funds, which is why there's that eligibility piece that Teresa described earlier. And there are other programs out there that are providing both rent assistance, which this one does not, and also services, right? So some of those might be the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, for example, will provide some services to help households prevent the loss of housing or assist them to find housing if they are homeless. There's a home help MN program that's going to help people with mortgages, and there's going to be a number of providers who are familiar with mortgage assistance that'll be helping those households. So there are some programs that exist out there that might function similarly, but in this circumstance, we're really looking at supporting the renter households who have been impacted by the pandemic with some kind of support while they're looking for housing or trying to prevent the loss of their housing, knowing full well that we no longer have those federal assistance rent funds available. And so the challenge that I think will be engaging to talk about as you move forward with Teresa, especially in those meetings, is what are the rent assistance resources if those are still needed for these households? Where can we find them? You know, what does that look like? What does that landscape look like for the resources that are available in these communities across the state? So it's definitely a challenging role that you're all going to be playing to try to support these households without the federal rent assistance being available.
We've had a couple questions requesting whether HMIS data reporting is a requirement of this program. HMIS will not be required for the Housing Stability Services program. However, on the quarterly report that you're submitting to Teresa and her team, there will be basic demographic info that you'll be asked to report. And so you'll want to track that in another manner outside of HMIS. And then we have another question here. Intake and eligibility requirement reporting. Can we receive verbal authorization of signature since our work is often remote?
Ooh, that is a good question. I know that the self-attestation is a way to get the services moving as quickly as possible. And we are trying to be flexible, knowing, like you said, that sometimes the services are remote. So I know that I had seen something referencing, like perhaps something via email or DocuSign would be acceptable. I can't give 100% yes to verbal, but can certainly follow up on that.
Thanks, Teresa. We have another questions coming. This is wonderful. Here's another question. And this is from an agency that's in court. So their services are provided in court. Would any eviction filing for non-payment of rent be automatically eligible for households under the households at risk of homelessness? Or do they also need to be eligible by median income? We can ask, okay, sorry, there was just another narrative there.
Right.
So will households, if they have households at risk of eviction that they see in court, are they automatically eligible, and or do they need to also meet the area's local AMI?
They need to meet the area's local AMI.
Thanks,
So
Teresa.
80% or below.
Another question here, who can make referrals to our organization?
So part of the referrals may be other organizations that you're currently working with, 211, the coordinated entry, some of the marketing that agencies might be doing to get the word out about the program. So this will be a case where there might have to be some proactive action on the part of the agency for the referrals to come. It's not like if you participated in the Rent Help MN, where the referrals all came from 211. So there will be perhaps a more active engagement to get referrals, but I don't think that there's a specific way. It kind of just depends on your organization, the clients that you typically serve, and the other agencies you partner with.
Teresa, there's a follow-up question to the one that you just answered. Do we track where referrals come from?
No, now that I am thinking, that's a good question. We do not have that on any of the reporting specific to where referrals are coming from. That would probably be a good topic for us to touch on in roundtables, because that might give other organizations an idea of how that's working at other agencies, but it's not something specific we're asking you to track.
As of this moment, that's all the questions in the chat, but I do suggest we wait a couple minutes in case anybody thinks of another one. Makram, I'm not sure if you have an additional question or if your hand is still up from the previous, but if you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask it. We did have one question in the chat, which I answered to that individual, but the question was, if we have no changes to our work plan or budget, do we need to submit those documents? And so the first question is, if you have no changes to your work plan, your program design, excuse me, you can indicate that on, I think it's question 2 of the work plan document. And whether or not you have changes to your budget, we still do want you to submit that document, even if it's unchanged. There's another question here. For the eligibility list, do they need to meet all, just one, or any combination? And Jennifer, if you have more to add to that, feel free to unmute.
Oh, they need to be at 80% of AMI or below, at risk of some type of housing instability, and then also have had a recent household member been on unemployment, had a decrease in, and then this third one is all bundled together. So any one of these. So 80% AMI, at risk of housing instability, And that's self-identified. It can be the client themselves saying, yes, I'm at risk of, losing my housing, I'm paying too much for it, whatever it happens to be. And then, yeah, there is a slide if we go back to it. And then the third part is that there has been a decrease in income, an increase in expenses, a person recently on unemployment, or any type of financial impact that the household has experienced. And that can either be directly or indirectly to the pandemic. So there doesn't need to be any type of documentation that, so they're going to self-attest, I've had an increase in expenses. But we're not asking any organization to like tie that back to how it relates to the pandemic. Was it directly or indirectly? This is going to be the household themselves attesting to these conditions. And they have to be a renter household in Minnesota. I should have said that very first. So this is renter households in Minnesota. So they do need to meet these requirements.
So Jennifer, if this answers your question, it's okay. Otherwise, if you have a more question, you can just unmute yourself and share your question or comments with us.
One more question here. Can we use this in combination with other programs?
So this,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, was that Diane?
That was me, but go ahead, go ahead.
This is a complicated question, so there's not a yes or no. So if there are other programs that can be leveraged as a complement to these services, that is wonderful. So let's say that an agency knows of another program that would help, pay application fees. Someone could be getting the HSS services, and then you're able to leverage those other programs as a complement. But it can't be an individual that's already getting a type of housing services. So let's say your organization itself has some type of housing programming, and you want to make that programming more robust. This wouldn't be an option to add this to that. If that what we want to make sure is that this program is open to anybody, as opposed to essentially adding another eligibility requirement that it might already be someone in another program of sorts. So that's kind of that is actually a short answer to the question. Does that get at what you're asking at?
And just, I think to Teresa's point, because it is sometimes complicated, definitely reach out if you're utilizing another funding source, and that's going to complement these funds, but you just want to make sure how they work together. We can help you go through that on an individual circumstance. So I can see where there could be overlap with other programs that you're working with the household on, but they might be something really specific that you're working with them on that's not necessarily the same as what this program is doing. And we just want to make sure that that part is clear, that the hours that you're spending with that client funded by another source are for a different purpose or a different intent than the hours that are being funded, that you're working with them with this grant.
Yes, thank you for adding that, Diane.
Sure. And I'm just going to ask again, Makram, if you would like to speak or have a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry for earlier there. The question I have is, so the duration of this funding is only 1 year. Is Is it only 1 year, or is it something that could be continued on, or just 1 year for this moment? I'm just trying to understand the scope and the scale of this, as we get into this project.
Teresa, do you want to take that question?
Sure, absolutely. So it is a 1-year contract. And at this time, we're not anticipating any additional time or money to be added beyond that 1 year. But I would always qualify that with, I would not say it's never a possibility, but we're not anticipating at this time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Amber has a question. Amber, you can unmute yourself and share your question or comment with us.
Yeah. Somebody call me. Nobody call me.
You can see if
Amber, I think you're still muted.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So just to kind of piggyback off of the multiple funding sources, we are able to utilize this and then place somebody into a hotel and ESG funds or help with rent with FHPAP or something along those lines, correct?
That's correct. You can utilize direct assistance through another source in order to assist that household with a payment of rent or utilities. So that would definitely be possible. I also,
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Amber. I want to note just for all of you that we are over our time, which does not mean that we have to stop taking questions. We actually extended our time just to make sure that we could answer additional questions. So you're welcome to stay on with us as we go through some of these additional questions. Angela Larson, I noticed that you also had a question. I'm going to unmute you and then hopefully.
Thank you. My question had to do with sort of that multiple funding source question again too. We put in our projector to do more with housing navigation. So it's you're not saying that we can't serve people who might be going into some other programs with finding that housing and doing that housing navigation with those clients before they enter in those programs, right? I mean, that's perfectly fine, right?
Right. Yeah, you're correct. That it's a complementary piece. So as long as that works perfect.
Okay, thanks.
I think another question from Angela in our question box, that what time frame is recent for unemployment, or how recent must the decrease in income increase in expense be?
For unemployment, it says for the past 6 months, and there's not a specific timeline for decrease in income or increase in expenses. It's just the client themselves testing to that they have had that during the pandemic. So they're not attesting to exactly when. I believe for Rent Help MN, we were using 2020 expenses. So it doesn't have to be something very recent if that's what you're giving at. Unemployment, it does say in the past 6 months.
So Teresa, this could be a follow question or related question. Is there a system in place for us at the agencies can or need to verify what people tell us as far as income change or housing stability?
So we will have an intake form that will be provided to the agencies to use to verify eligibility. And we are not asking agencies to collect pay stubs as part of that or show what their increase in expenses are. The intake form itself will be the client doing a self-attestation that they meet these requirements. So as an agency, if there's, you know, something additional you want to do to have them show their housing instability or whatever point you want to look at closer, that's okay. But from our standpoint, the self-attestation from the client that they meet these requirements show that they're an eligible family to be served.
Thanks, Teresa. We have another question. How many months does it cover after approval? And I wonder if that means how long can the household receive services after they've met that initial eligibility criteria? And Lo, if you have more to add to that, please feel free to unmute.
So that's a really good question. And there's not actually a limit from that as long as it falls within our contracted period. So there might be some families that need just some short-term support to resolve their rent instability, housing instability, but there might be some families that you're serving longer term, and that is all okay under this contract. And follow-up is a part of it, and that's a covered service. So again, even once a family is placed at, let's say they move into a supportive housing or some type of new housing situation, the grant allows the follow-up and the check-in, actually even encourages it, because sometimes just finding someone a home doesn't mean that they're housing stable at that point. So the follow-up is an important part of it without a defined time limit. Does that answer the question?
Yes, based on the chat. Thank you, Lo. It does answer that question. There was another question earlier asking if our PowerPoint slides will be made available. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted on the Housing Stability Services webpage. And as of this moment, that concludes our questions in the chat.
Nancy, I think another question we also answered just by ourselves was whether Minnesota Housing will give templates for invoices and other reporting, and answer was yes.
Correct.
Okay, I do not see any other questions or comments.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. And moving forward, I will probably be the person you are most likely encounter and work with, the primary contact for this. So please do reach out. My contact information is in the slide. And I'm happy to help or answer any questions that didn't get answered today. So thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Have a good day.